Some key concepts we must know for this lab are wavelength, emission intensity, and lambda max. Wavelength, measured in nanometers, is a measurement of the photon's wavelength being emitted. Emission intensity is the associated emission intensity for any given wavelength. This is displayed on the emission spectroscopy on the y-axis. It is proportional to the number of photons of any certain wavelength being emitted. The lambda max is a wavelength that has the greatest emission intensity. In other words, the lambda max represents the amount of energy of the photon that is being emitted with the greatest intensity. The equation on the bottom right relates energy to wavelength. The relationship between these two is inversely proportional, meaning that as one increases, the other decreases. So the research question we're trying to answer is, what determines the emission spectral lambda max? The hypothesis is that the emission spectral lambda max is determined by the observed color of the substance. Let's find out. If this were true, a solution with only one observable color, even if it's composed of two different dyes, would only have one peak on the emission spectra. This is the emission spectroscopy of a solution that looks bright orange to the human eye, but is actually a mix of red and green dye. Instead of only having one peak that should go from 600 to 640 nanometers, representing the orange, it has two, so this can't be true. Two other individual emission spectroscopy tests on the green and red dye, we can see that these are the two peaks represented in the first emission spectroscopy of the mixed solution because of their almost identical lambda maxes. The first peak on the emission spectra is green because on this peak the wavelength with the greatest emission intensity is 504, and on the individual test it has a lambda max of 508. And the second peak is a red dye, as this peak's wavelength with the greatest emission intensity is 614 and has a lambda max of 618 on the individual. This helps us determine that the observed color of a substance does not determine the lambda max on the emission spectra. Rather, it is the molecular composition that determines the lambda max. This is because each substance with its own molecular composition has a unique way in which it moves in between energy levels, and this produces a specific photon of light emitted with the greatest intensity, therefore determining the lambda max. The process of jumping energy levels can be explained with this diagram, where a photon is absorbed by an electron. With the energy from that, the electron is able to be excited to a higher energy state. When the electron regresses to its ground state, or when it relaxes, it emits a photon. This emission is visibly seen as light. This process can also be represented as this type of line diagram. The arrows going up represent absorption, and the ones going down represent emission. As can be seen, every individual level that the electron goes down emits a specific type of photon. This concept can be compared to an amusement park ride called a drop tower, where riders are lifted up a large vertical structure to a certain height and then released, letting them go down in a free fall. The riders can be representative of the electron, and the lifting of them can be compared to the absorption of a photon by the electron. When an electron descends energy levels, it emits a photon. When the ride drops from high to low, the riders emit screams.